Hello, welcome to the Purple Planet, where we help you drift into dreamland with the timeless and historical tales of queens, empresses, priestesses, and warriors from across the ages. In the waning years of the 16th century, as the world shifted and the tides of conquest and commerce lapped at the coasts of Central Africa, a girl was born who would one day become a legend. Nzinga Mbande, daughter of King Angola, Kiluwanji Kiasamba, and member of the royal Mbundu lineage, entered the world in 1583 amid the rolling grasslands, dense forests, and bustling villages of Ndongo. Her birth occurred at a time when her people, the Mbundu, were both inheritors of ancient traditions and witnesses to profound change, for the Portuguese had come to their shores, and with them the Atlantic slave trade. The Mbundu were a people of deep tradition. Their kinship systems were layered and robust, a tapestry of matrilineal and patrilineal descent winding through generations of oral history. Women occupied a unique place within their society. While political power typically resided with men, specifically the Angola, women could be powerful advisors, priestesses, healers, and even in times of crisis or exceptional ability, regents and rulers in their own right. The Queen Mother, or Kandala, often wielded extraordinary influence. In the royal household, senior women presided over rituals, guided decisions, and acted as intermediaries between the world of the living and the ancestors. Nzinga's early upbringing reflected the privileges and burdens of royalty. Her father, Ngola Kiluwanji, was a pragmatic and forward-thinking leader who recognized the value of both tradition and adaptation in a changing world. The Portuguese, since establishing the trading city of Luanda in 1575, had rapidly transformed the region's politics and economy. Their thirst for slaves and ivory drove them further inland every year, creating new pressures for the kingdoms of Ndongo and its neighbors. Raids and wars became more frequent. Alliances and betrayals occurred at a dizzying speed. The Portuguese, with their muskets and armor, seemed to bring both opportunity and threat. Kiluwanji wanted his children to be prepared for this new world. Nzinga, from an early age, displayed a sharp intellect and a fierce will that set her apart. She listened carefully to the stories of the griots, absorbing the oral histories that told of Mbundu glory, heroism, and tragedy. She was taught to read character, to judge wisely, and to speak persuasively. Her father ensured she learned the Portuguese language, understanding that fluency could grant power in both trade and diplomacy. Nzinga also trained in martial arts, for the royal children were expected to be able to defend themselves and their people. Her siblings, her brother Mbande, and her sisters Kifunji and Mukambu, were close companions. Royal childhood was a mixture of privilege and anxiety. The palace was a center of learning, but also of intrigue. Nzinga watched as her father and his advisors navigated the treacherous currents of court politics, foreign threats, and the ever-present risk of betrayal. She saw the devastation wrought by the slave trade, villages burned, families torn apart, children lost to the unknown horrors of ships and distant lands. These experiences would plant in her a deep sense of justice, an unbreakable resolve, and a pragmatic willingness to use any tool, diplomacy, war, or spirituality, for the preservation of her people. As Nzinga grew into adolescence, she was increasingly included in matters of state. she accompanied her father on diplomatic missions, where she observed the rituals of negotiation and the subtle gestures that could mean the difference between peace and war. Her keen mind and gift for languages made her a favored envoy. By her late teens, she had already served as a diplomatic intermediary between Ndongo and neighboring kingdoms. She learned to see the world not only through Mbundu eyes, but through those of outsiders. The Portuguese, the Imbangala mercenaries, and traders from distant lands. But childhood was brief for a royal in an age of upheaval. By the early 17th century, Ndongo was under siege. The Portuguese, now entrenched in Luanda, pressed ever further inland. Their demand for slaves was insatiable. They forged alliances with some local chiefs, promising wealth and weapons in exchange for captives, while attacking those who resisted. The Imbangala, bands of mercenary warriors, notorious for their brutality, became the Portuguese's most feared allies. They roamed the countryside, razing villages, and capturing men, women, and children to sell to Portuguese traders. Nzinga's father died as the pressure mounted, and her brother Mbande became king. His reign was marked by anxiety and uncertainty. The Portuguese advanced relentlessly, shrinking Ndongo's borders and decimating its population. Mbande's court was riven by suspicion. Some accused him of weakness, others of cruelty. Few could have managed the crisis well, but the burden of leadership sat heavy on Mbande's shoulders. It is said that he became increasingly paranoid, seeing enemies everywhere, and that he ordered the death of one of Nzinga's infant sons to prevent any challenge to his rule. Despite this loss, Nzinga remained at her brother's side, his closest advisor and chief diplomat. By 1622, the Portuguese governor in Luanda, Juan Correia de Sousa, demanded a meeting to discuss peace. Mbande, wary of walking into a trap, sent Nzinga as his emissary. This decision would change the course of Central African history. Nzinga's journey to Luanda was perilous. She traveled with a small entourage, bearing gifts and letters of safe conduct, but the threat of ambush or betrayal was real. When she arrived, she was met by the spectacle of colonial power. The whitewashed walls of the fort, cannons bristling, soldiers in shining armor. The Portuguese sought to humble her from the outset. At the first meeting, they provided no chair, an attempt to force her to kneel, literally and symbolically, before the governor. Nzinga refused to accept humiliation. With remarkable composure, she signaled to an attendant who knelt and offered his back as a seat. Nzinga sat with regal dignity, conducting the negotiation as an equal. This act, both practical and defiant, became legend. To the Portuguese, it was proof of her pride and cunning. To her people, it was a symbol of resistance and self-respect. The negotiations themselves were complex and fraught. Nzinga, fluent in Portuguese and skilled in the arts of persuasion, argued for the release of Ndongo captives, an end to the most brutal slave raids, and recognition of her brother's sovereignty. She offered gifts, fine cloth, ivory, and the promise of tribute, but refused to cede her people's independence. The governor, impressed by her intelligence and composure, agreed to a treaty. Hundreds of captives were released, and for a brief moment, hope flickered in Ndongo. But peace was fleeting. The Portuguese soon broke their promises. resuming attacks and encouraging dissension among Ndongo's chiefs. Mbande's position grew increasingly precarious. His court became a place of suspicion and fear. Some accused him of weakness, others of cruelty. In 1624, Mbande died under mysterious circumstances. Some said suicide, others whispered of poison or assassination. The kingdom teetered on the edge of collapse. Nzinga acted with characteristic boldness. She summoned the Sobas and invoked both tradition and spirit, claiming that her brother had named her as his successor. Her sisters Kifunji and Mukambu stood by her side, lending legitimacy to her claim. The Sobas were divided. Some supported her, others balked at the prospect of a woman on the throne. Yet through force of will, political acumen, and calculated displays of authority, Nzinga emerged as the new Angola of Ndongo. Her ascension was unprecedented, and it sent shockwaves through both her kingdom and the Portuguese ranks. Many European chroniclers dismissed her, believing a woman could not possibly consolidate power or command armies. They would soon discover how gravely they had underestimated Nzinga. Nzinga's reign began in blood and uncertainty. The kingdom of Ndongo, battered by years of war and slave raiding, was on the brink of collapse. Yet, from the moment she donned the mantle of queen, Nzinga displayed a resolve and ingenuity rare in any age. She understood that her enemies were many: rival Sobas, the Portuguese and their Imbangala mercenaries, and the ever-present threat of betrayal from within. Her first priority was survival. She gathered her loyalists and, with a daring march, relocated the court to Matamba, an ancient kingdom nestled in thick forests east of Ndongo. Matamba's rulers, themselves wary of Portuguese aggression, agreed to offer sanctuary. In exchange, Nzinga promised alliance, but it quickly became clear that she would not be content as a mere guest. Within a few years, she became the undisputed ruler of Matamba, fusing the kingdom's traditions with her own. Matamba, under Nzinga's leadership, became a fortress of resistance. She welcomed all who had suffered at Portuguese hands: refugees, runaway slaves, dispossessed nobles, and even defeated enemies willing to swear loyalty. Her forces swelled, becoming a multi-ethnic army united by desperation and hope. Nzinga reorganized her realm, building new fortifications, training soldiers, and establishing a disciplined, centralized administration. Her military was remarkable for its inclusivity. Women served as warriors and commanders, echoing her own refusal to be bound by convention. Nzinga became a master of unconventional warfare. She avoided open battles when possible, preferring ambushes, sabotage, and night raids. Her troops struck at Portuguese supply lines, liberated captives, and melted back into the forests before the enemy could respond. The Portuguese, accustomed to quick victories, found themselves mired in a war they could not win outright. Yet, it was not only on the battlefield that Nzinga excelled. She was a consummate diplomat, always seeking advantage through negotiation as well as force. She sent emissaries to neighboring kingdoms, seeking alliances against the common foe. She corresponded with the Kingdom of Congo, whose own fortunes had waned under Portuguese pressure. Nzinga was always looking for the next opportunity, the next crack in the enemy's armor. Her greatest diplomatic coup came in the 1640s, when the Dutch West India Company launched attacks on Portuguese Angola. Sensing a chance to shift the balance, Nzinga offered the Dutch an alliance, African soldiers, and safe passage in return for weapons, supplies, and support against the Portuguese. The Dutch, eager to undermine their Iberian rivals, agreed. Together, Nzinga's forces and the Dutch confronted the Portuguese in a series of fierce battles. The most celebrated of these was the Battle of Combi in 1647. Nzinga, now in her 60s, led from the front, her presence in battle both rallying and awe-inspiring. Chronicles describe how she sometimes wore male dress, carried a sword, and rode at the head of her troops. Her personal guard, a corps of women warriors, became legendary, their martial prowess matched only by their loyalty. The combined might of Nzinga's Matamba and the Dutch temporarily routed the Portuguese. For a brief moment, it seemed that the dream of restoring Ndongo and freeing its people from foreign domination was within reach. Yet, the Dutch soon withdrew, their interests in Africa wavering as fortunes shifted in Europe and the Americas. Once more, Nzinga's kingdom stood alone. Still, her enemies had learned to fear her. Portuguese chroniclers described her as a man in spirit, a leader whose cunning and audacity confounded the expectations of both Africans and Europeans. Among her own people, Nzinga became a living legend, a queen who defied the world, who protected the weak, and who never surrendered to despair. Religion was both a weapon and a shield in Nzinga's struggle for power. Early in her reign, she recognized that spiritual matters were inseparable from politics, not only among her own people, for whom ancestral rites and the favor of spirits were essential, but also in her dealings with European powers. During her negotiations in Luanda, Nzinga had allowed herself to be baptized by the Catholic Church, taking the Christian name Ana de Sousa in honor of the governor's wife, who acted as her godmother. To the Portuguese, this was a sign of submission and civilization. To Nzinga, it was a calculated move. She understood that conversion could be a diplomatic tool, enabling her to negotiate on more equal terms, and perhaps even to shield her kingdom from the worst excesses of missionary zeal. Yet, Nzinga never abandoned the spiritual traditions of the Mbundu. She continued to honor the ancestors and participate in indigenous rituals, blending Christian symbols with local practices in a manner that confounded outsiders. Her court became a place where Catholic priests and Mbundu diviners alike vied for influence, a testament to Nzinga's ability to hold multiple identities at once. This duality was reflected in her rule. She enforced Christian morality in some matters, outlawing certain practices to appease foreign priests, but she never allowed herself to become a puppet of the church. She used Christian festivals as occasions for diplomacy, while celebrating the great rites of the Mbundu calendar with equal fervor. Her people, too, adapted, honoring both the cross and the spirits of the land. Nzinga's gender was a similarly complex matter. Portuguese chroniclers, steeped in their own patriarchal assumptions, often describe her as a man in everything but sex. For them, her authority and martial prowess were so extraordinary as to seem unnatural. Yet, among the Mbundu, the queen was revered as both a warrior and a mother, a protector whose power derived not from her gender, but from her spirit and her deeds. Legends grew around her. Some claimed she possessed supernatural strength, that she could not be killed in battle, or that she rode into combat carrying both a sword and a cross. She became a figure of myth as well as history. a symbol of all that her people had lost and all that they still hoped to regain. The final decades of Nzinga's reign were marked not by constant war, but by the hard work of reconstruction and governance. By the 1650s, Matamba had become not just a redoubt of resistance, but a thriving, centralized kingdom in its own right. Nzinga, ever pragmatic, turned her attention to the tasks of statecraft. She reformed Matamba's administration, creating a bureaucracy that could manage the sprawling population of refugees, soldiers, and settlers who now called the kingdom home. She established new systems of taxation and land distribution, ensuring that her supporters were rewarded and that the kingdom's resources were put to effective use. Agriculture flourished under her rule. Nzinga encouraged the cultivation of manioc, maize, and other crops, making Matamba less dependent on volatile trade with the Portuguese. She opened her borders to runaway slaves and refugees from across Central Africa, offering protection and a chance at a new life. Matamba became a beacon, a place where the dispossessed could find hope and where the dream of African sovereignty was kept alive. Nzinga remained vigilant against Portuguese aggression, maintaining her alliances and keeping her armies ready. Yet, she also engaged in diplomacy, negotiating with both the Portuguese and other African rulers. To secure her kingdom's future, she was a tough negotiator, always seeking to extract the maximum advantage from every treaty. In her personal life, Nzinga continued to rely on her sisters, Kifunji and Mukambu. They were her closest advisors and the pillars of her rule, each with their own following and responsibilities. Family remained both a source of strength and a potential vulnerability. The Portuguese never ceased attempting to exploit divisions within the royal house. Nzinga's reign was remarkably long. By the time of her death in 1663, she was about 80 years old, an extraordinary lifespan for the era and a testament to both her resilience and her luck. She died in Matamba, surrounded by her court and her loyal followers, having preserved her kingdom's independence against all odds. With Nzinga's passing, a chapter closed in the history of Central Africa, but her legacy only grew in stature. Among her people, she was mourned as a mother and savior, a queen who had preserved the spirit of Ndongo and Matamba in the face of annihilation. Her efforts to shelter refugees, resist the slave trade, and outmaneuver her enemies became the foundation of national memory. The Portuguese, for their part, feared and reviled her. Their chroniclers accused her of cruelty and cunning, casting her as a witch and a usurper. Yet, even they could not deny her intelligence and tenacity. Missionaries who had met her spoke with a blend of awe and concern, describing a leader who could quote Christian scripture one moment and invoke ancestral spirits the next. Legends multiplied in the years after her death. Some told of how Nzinga's spirit wandered the forests, watching over her people. Others claimed that she had never truly died, but lived on in the hearts of those who resisted oppression. Myths spoke of her riding into battle with both a sword and a cross, her strength undiminished by age or sorrow. The impact of the Atlantic slave trade in Nzinga's lifetime cannot be overstated. Millions were torn from their homes, the fabric of societies ripped apart. Nzinga's resistance, both military and diplomatic, offered a rare example of African agency in an age of catastrophe. Her willingness to negotiate, to fight, and to adapt, ensured that the kingdoms of Ndongo and Matamba survived when so many others vanished. Today, Nzinga is honored as a national hero in Angola. Statues stand in her memory, and her story is taught to children as an example of courage, wisdom, and unyielding resistance. Scholars continue to debate the details of her life, but all agree on her significance. Nzinga Mbande was one of the most extraordinary leaders of 17th century Africa, a woman whose legacy endures in both history and legend.